Somewhere over the Western Desert in 1942, a Bristol Beaufighter came back from a strafing run with all 6 propeller tips bent backward. The pilot had pressed so low against the packed sand, putting cannon shells into the cabs of Rommel's supply trucks, that both spinning propellers struck the desert floor. Rock and hardpan chewed each blade tip across both engines into curves no engineer had drawn. He nursed the vibrating, shuddering machine home and landed it. Ground crew gathered around the damage and stood there for a long time, saying nothing. In the grinding months of the Western Desert Campaign, when the RAF threw everything it had at Axis convoys snaking along coastal roads, Beaufighters routinely attacked at altitudes measured in single-digit feet. They pressed through ground fire, dust plumes, the shrapnel of their own explosions. A propeller striking the earth and the aircraft coming home registered as operational routine. That wasn't a thoroughbred. That was a barroom hooligan, and it outscored the Mosquito. 965 confirmed aerial victories across the Second World War, third highest of any aircraft type in the entire Royal Air Force, behind only the Spitfire's 5,950 and the Hurricane's 4,540, and ahead of the de Havilland Mosquito's 835. The wooden wonder, the aircraft that fills the coffee table books and the television documentaries, scored fewer kills than the ugly one. That evidence has sat in the open for 80 years. Today it gets read into the record. One piece of received wisdom needs putting down first. Whispering Death, the nickname supposedly bestowed by Japanese or Burmese troops in Burma, appeared in print for the first time in April 1943 in Flight magazine, framed as rumour rather than confirmed enemy intelligence. By 1945, Bristol Aircraft had adopted it as a company marketing line. 14 cylinders of Hercules radial at full power produce a thunderous snarl that carries for miles. Allied propaganda, nothing more. Don Parker knew what the Beaufighter actually sounded like, from the inside, at night, when an engine caught fire. Parker flew Beaufighters with No. 29 Squadron during the Night Fighter campaign of 1940 and 1941, alongside a pilot named Guy Gibson, the same Gibson who would lead 617 Squadron's Dam Busters raid in May 1943, and who would die over the Netherlands in September 1944. Gibson survived long enough to write his memoir, Enemy Coast Ahead. In those pages, he set down what happened to Don Parker, with the compressed understatement peculiar to men who had watched these things happen too many times to afford feeling about them. Parker's Hercules engine caught fire in the air. Flame erupted along the nacelle, licking toward the wing root where the fuel tanks sat. The cockpit filled with the acrid stench of burning oil, and the decision window collapsed to seconds. Bail out or burn. Poor old Don had to bail out, Gibson wrote. 7 words carrying the weight of a man's near death in their deliberate smallness. Parker got out. He survived. Others on 29 Squadron didn't. His story, a man who did everything right and still nearly died because his own aircraft tried to kill him, became the thread that runs through every chapter of the Beaufighters' war, from the black skies over England to the mud-slicked strips of New Guinea. The aircraft Parker strapped into each night bore no resemblance to any fighter most pilots had known. The Bristol Aeroplane Company designed it in a hurry, cannibalizing wings, tail, and empennage already in production for the Beaufort torpedo bomber and grafting them to a new, wider fuselage. Chief Test Pilot Cyril Ewins took the prototype airborne on July 17, 1939. 2 Hercules sleeve valve radials pulled the heavy airframe to speeds near 320 miles per hour at altitude, fast enough to catch anything the Luftwaffe sent over Britain after dark. vastly superior to the obsolete Blenheim. Devastating forward-firing armament gave it killing power unmatched by any contemporary fighter. But the result was big, heavy, and profoundly ugly. Where the Spitfire offered elliptical grace, the Beaufighter presented flat slabs and the blunt menace of a docker's fist. Pilots didn't fall in love with it. They learned to survive it first. And the ones who managed that developed a loyalty so fierce it has outlasted them, passed to sons and grandsons who keep the logbooks and the photographs. Parker's war was a night war. By autumn 1940, the Battle of Britain had been won in daylight, but the Luftwaffe had pivoted to bombing after dark, the Blitz, and Fighter Command had almost nothing to stop it. Blenheim night fighters couldn't catch the bombers. Their armament couldn't guarantee a kill, even on the rare occasion they found one. Into this gap stepped the Beaufighter, carrying the AI Mark IV airborne interception radar. And the world Parker inhabited as a result was unlike any other combat flying of the war. The AI Mark IV was crude by later standards. The radar sent pulses into the darkness ahead and picked up returns from objects in the beam, projecting them as blips on a cathode ray tube in the navigator observer's cramped station behind the pilot. Parker's navigator had to interpret those dancing blips in real time, calling out range and bearing corrections over the intercom to a pilot who could see nothing beyond his instrument panel. Target bearing 5 degrees port, range 2 miles, slightly above. Parker adjusted heading and altitude on instruments alone, flying blind through absolute blackness over a country where every light had been extinguished and the only visible glow came from fires already burning on the ground. If the radar held contact, the navigator talked the pilot closer. The range wound down on the scope. 2 miles, 1 mile, half a mile. Closing speed demanded careful management. Too fast and you'd overshoot past the bomber, sliding into the rear gunner's cone of fire, or worse, colliding in the dark with an aircraft you'd never actually seen. Too slow, and a nervous bomber crew might spot your exhaust, dump the nose, and vanish. At the last few hundred yards, if the geometry held, the target's exhaust flames would materialize in the blackness ahead, a faint orange shimmer that suddenly resolved into the silhouette of a Junkers or a Heinkel, close enough to fire. Miss that moment by a few degrees of closing angle, and the target dissolved into night again. Start over. Circle blind. Burn fuel. Wait for another vector from ground control, while the city beneath you took another load of incendiaries. Some nights the entire process yielded nothing. Hours of exhausting instrument flying and radar searching that ended with a landing on a blacked-out airfield, the pilot wrung out and the navigator's eyes aching from staring at the scope. Parker and Gibson flew these sorties from 29 Squadron's base through the winter of 1940 and into 1941, night after night. Landing after hours of sustained concentration, with only the faintest hooded lights marking the runway threshold, tested nerves already corroded by weeks and months of this routine. Gibson's memoir records the accumulation without drama. Names appear in the text and then stop appearing. Incidents are piled up in prose that refuses to rise. He writes in a register so deliberately flat that the horror lives in the gaps between sentences rather than in the sentences themselves. The emotional idiom of men who'd learned to compress their responses to match the frequency of loss. Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham of No. 604 Squadron proved the system's potential on the night of the 19th to the 20th of November 1940. Flying a radar-equipped Beaufighter, Cunningham detected and destroyed a Junkers Ju-88 over blacked-out England. The RAF's first confirmed aerial victory using onboard radar to find and intercept an enemy aircraft at night. a technological watershed that would reshape the entire air war over Europe. His Beaufighter's speed let him overhaul targets the Blenheim couldn't reach. Heavy forward armament firing explosive 20mm shells meant catching them ended matters in seconds, not minutes. Whitehall panicked at the thought of radar becoming public knowledge. The Ministry of Information credited Cunningham's extraordinary success to his night vision, supposedly enhanced by eating carrots. Cat's Eyes Cunningham entered national mythology. The aircraft that made the interception, and the AI Mark IV radar that Parker's own navigator wrestled with every sortie, remained invisible to the British public. Even in its first and most consequential triumph, the Beaufighter was written out of its own story. Across numbers 29, 219, 255, 600 and 604 squadrons, Beaufighter crews accumulated kills through the Blitz, methodically bleeding the Luftwaffe's night bomber force and turning Britain's air defence from a helpless endurance of punishment into an active, lethal system that made German crews dread the dark as much as the civilians below. Parker was part of that campaign. Gibson wrote about it with the same flat compression he applied to everything else. A man dead on Monday mentioned in the same register as a radar malfunction on Wednesday. Each event given exactly as much emotional weight as the other, which was almost none. That restraint is what makes his account of Parker's engine fire so powerful. Gibson doesn't describe what Parker felt as the fire spread. He doesn't record the calculations racing through Parker's mind: altitude, airspeed, terrain, the location of the nearest place to land, whether the fire had reached the wing route yet. He gives it 7 words and moves on. Poor old Don had to bail out. On a Beaufighter squadron, a man's engine catching fire and forcing a night bailout warranted no more than that. Engine fires were one hazard among several that the Beaufighter inflicted on its own crews without any help from the Luftwaffe. Most notorious was the torque swing on takeoff. Combined rotational force from both Hercules engines wrenched the aircraft sideways as it thundered down the runway, and pilots were drilled to hold the wheels firmly on the ground past 150 miles per hour, because lifting off before the rudder had enough airflow to counteract that swing could send the aircraft cartwheeling off the strip in a fireball of fuel and ammunition. Every takeoff of every sortie carried this risk. A crosswind gust, a moment's inattention, and breakfast the next morning had an empty chair nobody mentioned by name. Operational training units lost men with grim regularity to this single characteristic, and every Beaufighter pilot understood the particular silence that settled over a mess hall after a failed departure. Compounding this was a manufacturing shortcut born of wartime desperation. Early production Beaufighters left the factory without propeller feathering equipment, the mechanism that turns a dead engine's propeller blades edge-on to the airflow, stopping them from windmilling. Wartime manufacturing shortages meant the feature was simply omitted. If an engine failed on one of these early machines at low altitude, heavy with fuel and ammunition, barely above stalling speed, the dead propeller kept spinning uselessly in the slipstream, dragging the aircraft into a yaw the rudder couldn't overcome. At 200 feet after takeoff, the physics offered no negotiation. Roll toward the dead engine, no altitude for recovery. Faultless pilots died in those crashes, killed not by the enemy, but by a procurement decision made in a factory they'd never seen. Parker escaped his fire. He escaped the torque swing, the asymmetric thrust traps, and everything else the Beaufighter threw at him. Gibson noted his bailout and moved on, because that was how you wrote about these things when they happened often enough to become ordinary. Poor old Don had to bail out, carries the compressed weight of everyone on 29 Squadron who didn't have Parker's margin of altitude or Parker's fraction of luck, or Parker's chance of being remembered at all. By early 1942, the de Havilland Mosquito night fighter entered service. It stepped into the role Beaufighter crews had built from nothing during the worst months of the Blitz. It inherited the radar technology they'd proven in combat, the tactical doctrines they'd written in blood, and the public credit they'd earned over burning English cities. The pioneer was shuffled aside so the prettier replacement could take the bow. But losing that spotlight freed the Beaufighter for the missions that would ultimately define it: anti-shipping strike, ground attack, long-range maritime interdiction. Work that demanded an aircraft built like a bouncer. Coastal Command seized on the Beaufighter's structural toughness and devastating forward firepower for anti-shipping operations, and the mission profile they created ranked among the most dangerous in the entire service. Fly at 50 feet above the waves, low enough for salt spray to film the windscreen, straight toward a convoy of armed merchant ships and their escort vessels, which opened fire with everything they had the moment an aircraft broke the horizon. Hold course, straight and level. Torpedo-equipped Beaufighters, known as torpedoes, carried their torpedo. Rocket-armed variants carried 8 projectiles fitted with 60-pound high-explosive warheads. Both weapons demanded stable, predictable flight to aim. Evasive maneuvering wasn't an option. You flew a straight run into a wall of tracer and steel, with the sea close enough to touch below you and absolutely no margin for error above. The North Coast Strike Wing became the most famous of Coastal Command's Beaufighter formations. They conducted attacks repeatedly along the Norwegian coast, across the grey North Sea and down into the Bay of Biscay, into the teeth of German convoy defences. Strikes went in at wave-top height, straight and level into the wall of defensive fire, releasing at close range against hulls that filled the windscreen. A 2-second burst from the Beaufighter's heavy armament could gut a merchant ship's bridge superstructure in a single low-level pass. Radial engines absorbed battle damage that would have killed an inline power plant. Lose a cylinder, and the Hercules kept producing power, diminished but still turning. The airframe soaked up punishment with the grace of a railway bridge and kept flying. Numbers from the North Coast Wing measure achievement and cost in equal proportion. Over 150,000 tons of Axis shipping sunk. 117 vessels sent to the bottom. Price paid, 120 Beaufighters lost, and 241 aircrew killed or missing, from one strike wing. Gone into the grey North Sea. Blown apart by shipborne flak over Norwegian fjords. Burning on the water's surface as aviation fuel pooled around wreckage that had been an aircraft and a crew minutes before. Loss rates on these operations ranked among the highest in the RAF, and the men who flew them understood the arithmetic in intimate, personal terms. They flew the sorties anyway, because the convoys kept sailing, and someone had to stop them. After Corsica's liberation in late 1943, Beaufighter squadrons, including numbers 272 and 252, deployed to the island's improvised airstrips and launched strikes against Axis supply lines along the Italian and southern French coasts. Flying at masthead height over the Tyrrhenian and Ligurian seas, they threaded through coastal flak batteries that had learned their approach patterns. Small units, repeated runs against the same coastal stretches, flak gunners adjusting with lethal efficiency. Corsica carried a claustrophobic intensity that the vast North Sea operations lacked. No large formation to dilute personal risk. One crew in one aircraft, wave-top height, heading into guns aimed at them specifically. Every empty chair at the evening meal had belonged to someone everyone had spoken to that morning. Halfway around the world, the Royal Australian Air Force discovered the Beaufighters' limits in the hardest way possible. Number 30 Squadron, RAAF, deployed to Port Moresby in early 1943, operating from a forward base at the outer edge of Allied reach in Papua New Guinea. Tropical heat warped metal airframes. Humidity rotted fabric coverings on control surfaces. Mud ran deep enough to swallow vehicles. Malaria hospitalized more aircrew than Japanese action did. Japanese fighters turned the Beaufighters' weight into a death sentence. Nakajima Ki 43 Oscars and Mitsubishi A6M0s were lighter, faster in the climb, and capable of turn rates the heavy British twin couldn't begin to match. Engaging either in a turning fight was suicide. Straight-line speed at typical Pacific combat altitudes gave margins so thin they barely existed. Veterans' accounts and operational assessments used language that didn't soften the truth. RAAF Beaufighters were dangerously slow in the presence of Japanese fighters. Number 30 Squadron recorded 23 confirmed aerial kills and 4 probables during Beaufighter operations. Those numbers sound modest until the conditions register. No Spitfire escort flew above them. Numerical advantage didn't exist on any given sortie. What the Beaufighter offered was ferocious forward firepower, capable of destroying a Japanese aircraft in a single pass if geometry allowed, and enough structural stubbornness to absorb punishment and bring the crew home, provided a Zero didn't catch them in the turn. Every one of those 23 kills was earned by men flying an aircraft that couldn't outrun or outmaneuver its opponents, from a base where disease competed with the enemy for their lives. The men who flew from Port Moresby became the Beaufighter boys in Australian memory, a phrase that carries a weight only their families truly feel. Sons keep the logbooks now. Grandsons keep the photographs and the memory of what their people flew. They know the names that didn't come home, and they have waited decades for someone to say plainly that what their people did in that aircraft from that place mattered. It mattered. As a high-altitude bomber, pathfinder, photo reconnaissance platform, fighter bomber and intruder, the Mosquito was extraordinary. A Swiss Army knife whose aerial combat was almost incidental to its broader contribution. Grant all of that, honestly, as it should be granted. In the specific mission both aircraft shared, finding enemy aircraft and destroying them, the Beaufighters' scoreboard stands higher. Don Parker got out. His engine fire, his night bailout, his 7-word appearance in Gibson's memoir. These have become part of the Beaufighters' permanent record. Parker's survival was the better outcome. Hundreds of identical emergencies across Beaufighter squadrons worldwide. Engine fires, asymmetric thrust failures, training crashes, operational losses at sea level and in jungle skies produced only a line in a squadron operations record book and a telegram delivered to a family who'd spend the rest of their lives inhabiting the silence that followed. Gibson's prose, flat, compressed, deliberately unremarkable, was the only honest register for men who understood what the Beaufighter demanded. You flew. The engine held or it caught fire. You held the swing on takeoff or the swing took you. The torpedo run worked or the flak found you at 50 feet above the sea. Parker got out. That he's remembered at all is because Guy Gibson wrote his name in a book that became famous for reasons having nothing to do with the Beaufighter. In that single fact, the whole story of the aircraft's neglect is contained. Some of you built the Airfix Beaufighter kit as boys. Kitchen table, tube of polystyrene cement, a too-thick paintbrush borrowed from a parent, Hercules nacelles pressed carefully onto wing roots with both thumbs, canopy glued on slightly crooked, Decals smoothed down with a wet finger. Others among you had the dinky toy, solid die-cast, satisfyingly heavy in a child's hand, the propeller paint wearing through from years of carpet sorties across the living room floor. Your mates chose the Spitfire every time. You chose the ugly one. And you couldn't have explained why, except that it looked like it meant business. You were right. For Don Parker, who bailed out of a burning engine at night and lived to have his name preserved by a man who'd become a legend. For the 241 Coastal Command aircrew from North Coates, who flew straight and level into flak they could see coming and kept flying anyway. For the Beaufighter boys at Port Moresby, who never had the speed, the numbers or the odds, and flew anyway. For every pilot who held the swing past 150 and lived, and for everyone who lifted off too early and didn't. They flew the difficult one, the dangerous one, the one nobody put on the poster. It brought most of them home, and it won. Subscribe for more stories like this.